Hello and welcome to the Comics and More podcast. I'm Dave Ferraro from Comics and More.
And I'm Patrick Markfort from Articulate Nerd. Today we're going to be talking about one of the greatest comic book artists of all time, Jack Kirby. Now, Kirby's career was much too long, varied, and influential to sum up in a single podcast. So in this episode, we're going to be focusing in on a particular era of Kirby's long career. We're going to look at his work in collaboration with the writer Stan Lee at Marvel Comics in the 1960s. So this is the era in which Lee and Kirby and a few other artists, notably Steve Ditko, essentially created the modern Marvel Universe. Characters like the Avengers, the Incredible Hulk, the X-Men, these were all created by Jack Kirby in collaboration with Stan Lee. And throughout the 60s, they produced some pretty spectacular comic books. Some people would say some of the greatest superhero comics ever done. I would be one of the people who would say that. I'm a big fan of the Silver Age Marvel comic books, particularly the work of Jack Kirby. So even this era is really too much to sum up in a single podcast episode. So we're narrowing our focus even more and looking at a few issues that represent what we've identified as kind of the peak era on a couple of the books that Lee and Kirby collaborated on during this period. So we'll be looking at Fantastic Four, the book that sort of kicked off the Marvel Age of Comics, numbers 44 through 51, and we're also going to be looking at Thor, the comic book which began as Journey into Mystery but was retitled as Thor, numbers 129 through 135. So those comparatively short runs are part of much longer runs that Lee and Kirby had on each of those books. And we kind of think they represent kind of a peak representational period for each of those titles. So without further ado, we'll get into our discussion first of Fantastic Four, numbers 44 through 51. We read them in this giant Fantastic Four omnibus. This is volume 2. So this just collects a whole bunch of these issues in color. It's a really great way to get your hands on this stuff. So number 44 was the first issue of this period that we wanted to look at, and there's kind of a lot going on in this time in the book. A lot of things begin in issue number 44, which is why I thought it would be a good starting point. It's the first issue that Joe Sinnott comes on as the regular inker, so he was a real kind of force on that book, along with Lee and Kirby. Sinnott's involvement, his inking over Kirby's pencils, really kind of completed this triumvirate of wildly entertaining creative talent. So his first issue of this extended run was number 44. It's also the first appearance of Gorgon, who is one of the Inhumans, and this is the storyline where we are introduced to the Inhumans and the hidden city of Adelon. Medusa had been introduced previously as a villain, but we really didn't know anything about her past. So when Gorgon shows up looking for Medusa, it really takes the Fantastic Four on a wild ride and kind of begins to move the book into territory that was pretty unprecedented for superhero comics of that time. Also something that really gets going in these issues is these continuing stories. So we're sort of breaking away from the 20-issue standalone Villain of the Month episodes, and Kirby here is really starting to craft an ongoing sci-fi fantasy superhero saga. And, you know, superhero comics just hadn't operated on this kind of cosmic scale before. So it starts out small. You know, Gorgon shows up at the Fantastic Four's Baxter Building headquarters, but by the end of that storyline, we've uncovered a hidden city populated entirely by superpowered beings. And that storyline leads directly into one of the most acclaimed stories in the book's run, the Galactus trilogy, wherein the planet-devouring cosmic entity known as Galactus has arrived to consume the Earth, and his herald, the Silver Surfer, is introduced. Another wonderful character conceived by Kirby and then sort of adopted by Stan Lee as the mouthpiece of the more serious side of the Marvel philosophy. So the Silver Surfer starts out as something of a villain, but in a kind of Christ-like parable, sort of learns the ways of humanity and essentially saves the day, becomes the savior of humanity when he turns against the omnipotent Galactus. It's just a terrific trilogy.
Yeah, very epic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think when you read these books, you have to kind of, you know, as a Marvel Comics fan, you will have most likely encountered Galactus before you read these first Galactus issues. But I always try to put myself in the mind of someone who had been reading, you know, superhero comics of the 1960s. What it must have been like to encounter this kind of material. You know, it's really kind of taking it to another level.
Yeah, and you've actually read these before.
Yes, yep.
And
this was your first time.
Yeah, this is my first time reading these.
Run through a few times.
Yeah, I haven't even read much Jack Kirby, which is kind of embarrassing.
And I'm the big Kirby fan.
You are a big Kirby fan. I've only read like a couple issues. I think the first 2 issues of Fantastic Four from Jack Kirby and early X-Men. But other than that, I haven't really read much of him at all.
I like the early X-Men.
Yeah, and this was, I mean, there was a lot of great material here, obviously.
Yep. It's just like great story after great story after great story.
Yeah.
To go from Inhumans to Galactus, and then to follow Galactus directly with perhaps the single greatest issue in the run. Issue number 51, This Man, This Monster. It's just a staggering amount of creativity being poured out onto these pages.
Yeah, This Man, This Monster was one that it wasn't like it didn't go as I remembered it going. Like just because, you know, like Galactus trilogy, I knew how it went.
Right.
From encountering the story in other ways, probably like the cartoon and stuff like that.
Yep.
With This Man, This Monster, it wasn't what I was expecting. Like Galactus trilogy pretty much flows as I thought it would. But This Man, This Monster just kind of went places like... It was just kind of weird for me. It was kind of jarring to actually read that story because it was different than I expected it to be.
Yeah, this... I mean, so, you know, the Inhumans story arc started... The scope of the book began to expand. So by the time we got to Galactus, we are kind of trippy, cosmic... you know, level. You know, it's just like as big as a story can get. And the Fantastic Four basically have nothing to do during the Galactus trilogy other than stand around and look at these cosmic beings in battle with one another. I mean, this is some wild stuff. But then the next issue, very next issue, This Man, This Monster, is the most down-to-earth, simple, human story of this mad scientist, this unnamed scientist, who makes himself into a duplicate of the Thing and replaces Ben Grimm on the Fantastic Four with the intention of murdering Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards. And there's a bit of a twist ending. So on one level, it's kind of a standard kind of sci-fi plot, but the thing that astonishes me about This Man, This Monster is the level of emotion that Kirby and Lee and Sinet, but primarily Kirby, is able to bring out of these characters. I find it to this day to be an emotionally moving story, surprisingly so. You don't expect to encounter that kind of emotional power in superhero comics. It's melodrama, right? It's not, you know, nuanced literature, you know, but it's just really wonderfully crafted and, like I say, really kind of moving. It's a great issue.
Yeah, I think like just because I've read, you know, I came in it with modern comics, you know what I mean? I haven't really read too many older comics. So it was a little hard for me to get into that frame of mind to like read these, you know what I mean? It just felt like very dense and verbose, especially Stan Lee like describing the action that we're seeing on the page. It was just like it was a bit much, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So also like you mentioned that Jack Kirby was starting to experiment with a longer like form of storytelling. So it was like kind of like uneven with the issues. Like halfway through the last issue of the Galactus trilogy, I mean, the story's over, and it pretty much takes up with Johnny's story in college, and that stuff's behind us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's this really is. I mean, Kirby's. It's not that this is the first time there's ever been an extended story in comics.
Yeah.
But the type of kind of the level of and scope of storytelling that Kirby is doing here with this long, continuing, flowing saga, he's really uncharted territory. So there is a little bit of clunkiness there.
Yeah,
You're correct. The Galactus trilogy essentially begins halfway through issue number 48, which also concludes the Inhuman saga from the previous issue, and then the Galactus trilogy basically ends halfway through issue number 50, and then the rest of that issue is concerned with setting up subplots for upcoming issues. So there's a little bit of clunkiness in the creative team, and again, primarily Kirby, kind of figuring out how to pace these longer stories over multiple issues. But that goes away pretty quickly. And actually, I think these issues read pretty well in sequence, which is not true of a lot of comics at that time. I feel like with the Fantastic Four, especially, you can sit down and read a bunch of them at a time, and they flow really nicely. It's kind of like a graphic novel. You know, a very verbose graphic novel.
Yes.
Thank you, Stan Lee.